You're listening to The Luxury Item, the podcast on the business of luxury and the people and companies that are shaping the future of the luxury industry. Here's your host, Scott Kerr.
Spirits giant Bacardi is one of the major players in the Scotch whisky business, which is built around Dewar's as a global blended brand, plus a tight portfolio of single malt distilleries under John Dewars & Sons. One of the leaders at Bacardi that has been central to building Dewar's modern reputation, profile, and premium credentials is my guest on The Luxury Item, Stephanie Macleod, Director of Blending Scotch Whisky at Bacardi. Stephanie oversees the blending and innovation of some of the world's most awarded luxury whiskey brands, including Dewar's Scotch Whisky and Aberfeldy Single Malt Whisky. She made history in 2019 as the first woman ever to be named Master Blender of the Year by the International Whiskey Competition and has since gone on to achieve an unprecedented 6 consecutive wins, cementing her status as one of the most influential figures in the industry. With nearly 3 decades of expertise in whiskey craftsmanship, Stephanie leads a predominantly female-led team of blenders responsible for developing ultra-premium releases across Bacardi's portfolio. Welcome to The Luxury Item, Stephanie.
Wow, thank you for having me.
You lead blending for Dewar's and Bacardi's Scotch distilleries, and for those of my listeners who are uninitiated in the world of making whiskey and other spirits, could you just briefly explain the main role and responsibilities of a master blender in a distillery?
Well, a lot of people ask me that question. And um, as you could imagine, and the next question is, how do I become one? Is normally the next question I get. But yes, the role of the master blender is pivotal to making our whiskies. At Dewar's we have a range of blended Scotch whiskies as well as single malt whiskies, and so for us at Dewar's, my role is to ensure that every drop of spirit that is coming from our distilleries is the best quality that it can be. And then that spirit is filled into the correct cask types in order to fulfill the flavour profile of all of our whiskies. And we fill the whiskies into a variety of casks, bourbon casks from the US, sherry casks from Spain, casks that have previously held Scotch whisky, casks that have been rejuvenated. And then later on in the process, we will do what we call finishing. So that's where we take the whiskey from one type of cask and fill it into another type of cask. So, for instance, a wine cask or another type of sherry cask. So something that's going to add some depth and complexity to our whiskies. When we are looking at one of our single malts, for example, Aberfeldy, whereas with a blend, we're looking at different types of malt whiskies and different types of grain whiskies to form our blends, and those can be up to about 30 different spirit types. But for Aberfeldy, we're just looking at the spirit that is coming from Aberfeldy. But again, with Aberfeldy, as well as for, the single malts that go into our blends, we will fill Aberfeldy into bourbon casks, into sherry casks. And again, we may finish it at the end as well. So it's the same kind of disciplines that we use for our blends and for our single malts. But obviously they are treated in different ways, but the thought process, the planning is exactly the same for both types.
And it sounds almost like a combination of an art and a science.
It very much is. I have a science background, as do most of my team.
Mm-hmm.
And the scientific discipline is very important when you're thinking about the type of whiskey that you have and that you hope it will be in the future. And so the new make spirit that comes from the distilleries gives us an indication of how it's going to mature. I mean, what we want every time from our distilleries is exactly the same type of spirit. Sometimes we'll get these little variations, and so we may then have to think, could that be an exceptional cask in the future? So what
Mhm.
if we put it into this other type of cask, and let's see what happens to it. So, sometimes even if we're not thinking particularly about innovation, we may be presented with an opportunity just through studying the liquid and then thinking about what could that be in the future. So we're really not just thinking about, oh, this is a new make spirit and it's going to go into a cask. We're thinking about what is this new make spirit and what could it be in the future to add some depth and breadth to our portfolio.
And your journey into the world of whiskey and path to becoming the master blender at Dewar's and Bacardi's director of blending for Scotch Whisky was not a conventional one. You started off doing food science at a university and focused on sensory analysis. Could you talk about how Scotch whisky entered your world and what hooked you in?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, it was completely by chance that I got into the whiskey industry. And it was really because although, I was born in Scotland and educated in Scotland, I had no idea that the whiskey industry could provide me with a career in the future.
Hmm.
And it was almost like some kind of, well-known secret in Scotland. We knew that it was being made up in the Highlands and there was secret recipes and, there was men in tweed suits that assessed the spirit and oh, it was very, very secretive and, not much was known about it. And so I never saw it as being relevant to me. Whiskey was something that older relatives consumed, and perhaps the flavor profile wasn't quite what I would have wanted. I remember buying a single malt for my dad for his birthday when I was a student, and really not having much of a clue of what I was doing. So basically, the whiskey industry did not feature on my radar. And
Okay.
so when I graduated, I joined, the soft drinks industry, and which I quite enjoyed. But then my supervisor from my university, my undergraduate course, phoned me and asked me if I would like to work with him to study the maturation of Scotch whisky. And that's really when I fell in love with whiskey, and not just with the whiskey itself or even the process of making whiskey, but the personalities of the people working with whiskies. They were so passionate about whiskey. They had such great knowledge. They had such great stories, and they really wanted to share them with me. And I knew at that point that whiskey really was where I wanted to be. And so I decided that after 4 years of academic study, that I didn't just want to study whiskey, I wanted to be part of whiskey. And that's when I joined Dewar's in 1998. I kind of worked my way through different departments. I was encouraged then to do more on the side of the laboratory and maturation and casks. And that's when I then began to study under the then master blender, Tom Aiken. And, it was basically an immersion in the world of blending, making up my own blends, talking to other blenders in the industry to find out what they did, and learning that blending is about patience, although that's one thing I've perhaps not mastered very well,
Mhm.
and understanding the importance of wood and the importance of knowing that you can never quite predict what a cask is going to do. They're natural, and so is the production of whiskey. It's it's 3 ingredients. We don't add any additives. It's just water, malted barley, and yeast, and oak casks and thyme.
Yeah.
So I, you know, it's. I knew that once I got into the whiskey industry, I wouldn't want to leave it. It's just every day is really a school day in whiskey.
Yeah, and after you joined John Dewar and Sons in the late 90s and 2006, you rose to becoming Dewar's seventh master blender in nearly 175 plus years of the brand's history, and the first woman, too. So, what do you think were the most pivotal moments that put you on that path?
Um, I mean, when I was asked to, did I want to train to be the master blender, and I realized that I would be the first woman. And Dewar's is Dewar's White Label in particular. It's a beloved, huge brand. You hear stories of people being buried with a bottle of White Label, and uh, you your product is with people at moments that matter for them. So you can be there at births, at weddings, and so it's a big responsibility that we show up in our very best form, because it means something to people, and that responsibility weighed on me quite a bit at the start, but it was also exhilarating to know that I was part of the legacy of Dewar's, and continuing, and in some small way, developing the house style of Dewar's, but also of our single malts as well.
When you took over
Yeah.
Dewar's Master Blender, did you see an untapped opportunity to push the brand into new territories?
Um, at that point, in 2006, when I became the master blender, China was starting to come onto our radar. The Far East
Mhm.
Asia, and I began talking with people about you know what was the perception of whiskey there, and and that's really where my first assignment came in. Um, I was asked then, could you blend a new expression of Dewar's, a Dewar's 15-year-old?
Mhm.
And I thought, wow, what a first assignment. And really what we were wanting to do was to tap into the Chinese market, and the flavors that they enjoyed there. And that market has changed completely since I first started working there. The Chinese market is very knowledgeable on Scotch whisky, and so we, through an assessment and blind tastings, we then came up with three candidates, um, for Dewar's 15-year-old, and they were all very, very different. And we then invited people from that market, people from other markets, to all come to Scotland, um, assess these three whiskies, and tell us which one they liked best. And luckily, they actually chose the one that I thought they
Mhm.
might go for, which luckily was the one that we had the most stock of. Um, so it was a phew moment when that happened. But it really was such a learning curve for me, to actually, tap into the, the market itself, finding out what our consumer wanted, and then trying to address that through the selection of the different malt whiskies and grain whiskies. And not only was it released in China, then the US took Dewar's 15 to its heart. And I really am very proud when people tell me, that's my favorite whiskey, and asking me how it came about. So it still is a great source of pride. And when people ask me, what is your favorite Dewar's whiskey? that is the one that I always talk about because it's the one that's closest to my heart because that was my first child.
You lead the sensory side of the business, which is tasting, grading, and selecting casks, deciding how they're combined, matured, and finished, so the whiskeys remain consistent yet interesting across time. The realities of modern operations mean huge warehouses with 10 thousands of casks, complex logistics, data systems, and process controls. How has your role evolved with these more complex parameters?
As our expressions of Dewars and our single malts have become more complicated, therefore so have our systems. And for example, our Dewar's double range, that is a four-step aging process. So at each stage, we are assessing the spirit and ensuring that, each element is exactly where it should be at that stage in the process. Um, and and it isn't just about the sensory assessment of the spirit. We work very closely with our laboratory
Mhm.
and through the analysis that they do on our maturation related compounds, um, their results then also, we assess these results along with our sensory results to see that there aren't just sensory markers, but there's also the markers from the maturation compounds. Um, so that these elements are very important. And one of the things that I did when I first started working at Dewars, I found it curious coming from an academic background that all of our sensory decisions were based on one person.
Mhm.
And so I decided that this was crazy and that we really needed to have a group of people who were also trained that could also assess the spirit as well. Um, and so it's important to have a collective of people who are trained in sensory analysis that can be assessing our spirit alongside me and my team, um, because we have a lot of products now. Um, and so it is really important that we have um, a breadth and depth of sensory ability that are assessing those spirits. And as you say, we have thousands of casks, and not only are we assessing the spirit that's in the casks, but we assess the casks before they are filled as well. Especially our sherry casks and our wine finish, the casks that we use for wine finishes, just to ensure that there is nothing there that could affect the spirit, because often we're using very old, very valuable spirit and putting them into these casks, and so we want to make sure that those casks are able to take these very old and very valuable whiskies, because it would be very upsetting um, if an off note reached these whiskies. So we take great care to ensure that there are no nasty surprises that come down the line, just by careful and systematic assessment, both sensory and chemical, at each stage of the process.
Scotch whiskey brands design new expressions or specific versions of a whiskey mainly to keep their business growing and their drinkers engaged while making the best use of the stock maturing in their warehouses. Who determines the market or brand need and hands you a brief?
So we have our brand teams who are constantly talking to our commercial teams in all of our markets, And we also have an insights team as well who are looking constantly at, what's the voice of our consumer? Because we are constantly looking at that as well, so that we aren't missing the mark. However, as I often, the example I often make is, smartphones. So I had no idea, 15 years ago that I really needed my phone to tell me where to go when I was driving,
Hmm.
and indeed to, help me do my banking. But now that it's here, I wouldn't know what I'd do without it.
Right.
So there is the the pool of what the consumer is telling us and what they're buying and what they like to taste. But there's also the experiments that we are doing, and just looking at different types of casks, and thinking, well, that could be really interesting. Our consumers haven't asked for it, but what happens if we try it? And things like the Dewar's Double Double 21-year-old. We filled them into um, magma stone toasted casks, and really just to see what it was like. What was the influence of the French oak, and what was the influence of the American oak. What happens if we adjust the toasting levels? What happens there? And it was an intriguing project for us, and we got some really amazing results from it. So in answer to your question, it's a bit of both. It's a bit of, the brand teams talking to us about what they're hearing, and then it's about us saying, well, why don't you try this?
Right.
We think it's terrific. What do you think? And, most of the time they are on board, and, you know, marketeers love a compelling story. And, the whiskey industry is built on amazing stories.
Right.
And, we find that our whiskey drinkers all over the world love to hear how we make whiskey. Why do we do what we do? And what are the results? And they love to hear about things that have failed as well. I don't know why, but
And Scotch whiskey blends can differ from region to region, primarily due to regional tastes and consumption styles. Scotch drinkers in the U.S. skew more towards sipping, collecting, and premium exploration. While I'm assuming much of Asia's Scotch is more tied to status, mixing, and social occasions. How do you tailor expressions to complement regional tastes and consumption habits?
well, the recipes for, Dewar's White Label, Dewar's 12, Dewar's 15, those remain no matter where it goes to in the world. Um, our strap line used to be on Dewar's was, never varies. So we don't adjust the blend recipe depending on where it goes. But, you're right. People drink whiskies in different ways, and they enjoy it in different occasions. And, I do quite a bit of traveling all over the world, and I love to watch how people, enjoy our whiskies. I remember going to um, China in about 2008, 2009, and they loved pouring Dewar's 12 into a pitcher with
Hmm.
lots of ice,
Well,
almost the way you would serve beer in the US and now in the UK. So I was appalled. I thought, oh my
a
goodness,
pitcher of whiskey.
how could they? But then I thought, well, they're enjoying it. That's how
Right.
they like to drink it. And so that was a really valuable learning for me because, I thought, we make whiskey to be enjoyed. That's the whole purpose of making whiskey. And, we also look at, what is igniting people in terms of culture. And we realized that in the US, Japanese culture, Japanese ways of presenting food and drink were really important in the US. And so again, double 21-year-old, we sourced some Mizunara casks from Japan. So they were made in a cooperage in Japan, and shipped to us. And this was actually, 2020 during lockdown. We were, waiting in these casks coming through with all the confusion that was going on in the supply chain. But these beautiful casks arrived, as if nothing had been happening. And we filled some with double 21-year-old. And, I don't know if you've ever tried a Mizunara finish,
I
but
have
it
not.
just gives
Yeah.
this beautiful, ethereal, perfumed aroma to the whiskey. And, it's very pared down, and, it's just a beautiful whiskey. And it was actually ranked number 7 in the Whiskey Advocates top 20 most exciting whiskies of 2023. And I think it scored something like 95 points or something like that.
Mm.
And so, we were really proud of it. Again, it was one of these things we thought we would experiment, and, we thought, well, we love it. So, we think everybody else will love it. And they did. And, people still, I'm traveling about, they keep telling me again how much they loved that particular expression. And we then start to build confidence, because, we think, well, you know, we like it. We love drinking whiskey. We love, drinking other types of spirits and wines. We believe we've got a really good palate, and it's good to see that is then translated to, yes, our consumers love it as well.
India is a priority for Dewar's because it's a huge, fast-growing whiskey market that is trading up to premium Scotch, and recent tariff cuts make long-term growth even more attractive. I believe India is actually the world's largest whiskey drinking nation by volume. How are you tuning your flavors to Indian preferences where luxury and super premium tiers dominate Scotch growth there?
Yeah, I mean, India, it is, you're right, it's our number one export by volume. Um, and they love whiskey, and there's this, burgeoning middle class who are really excited by Scotch whisky. Um, so I've been to India a number of times, and the message that I get from them is that, we don't want anything different from the rest of the world. We want to be drinking the same as they're drinking in America or in Japan or in France. We enjoy the taste of Scotch whisky, and Dewar Scotch whisky and the single malts, and we want it to be that way. But um, you know, India is a vast continent, and so it would be wrong to say that the north of India has exactly the same needs and requirements for flavor as the south of India. And but I can see us doing something um that would reflect the different Indian tastes. I mean, we also, we obviously do different packs for different holidays. Diwali is one that we do, but that really is just a different pack that we do. Um, but I've really only been to Mumbai and New Delhi, so I've only scratched the surface of India. But one of my team actually is from India, Anija. So she gave up, her life in India to pursue her dream of working in Scotch whisky. So if we're writing any tasting notes, and I'm wanting it to be for the Indian market, she will help me out and pinpoint notes that are important to her. And so I'm thinking to Indian consumers. But it's a very exciting market. And obviously we have a free trade agreement that's in progress with India. So it's going to be exciting there. You know, everyone is very energized by the thought of the Indian market.
I want to talk about the American consumer. American consumers may have embraced whiskey over the past 2 decades, but that enthusiasm largely hasn't centered around blended Scotch. There are exceptions, of course, brands that have grown and solidified their status, but overall volume has struggled to remain relevant to the current generation. Blended Scotch has shown signs of stabilization and selective growth over the past few years, especially at the premium and super premium ends. What's your strategy for designing expressions that move drinkers up in price and status?
Yeah, I mean, premiumization is our strategy um, with blended Scotch, you know, with our Dewar's range. And you know, when I became the master blender in 2006, I made it one of my aims. You know, the first aim was, as the first female master blender for Dewar's, I wouldn't be the last.
Hmm.
And the second aim was that I wanted to show that a blended Scotch could be every bit as interesting and luxurious as a single malt. And uh, you know, I remember doing a tasting in London, and I decided to play a little game. And you know, I said, "Is everyone up for doing a blind tasting?" And I had Dewar's 12-year-old and I had Aberfeldy 12-year-old, and they didn't know what they were drinking. I asked them, "Can you pick out for me, you know, which ones are the single malt and which one are the blends?" And I think one person got it right out of a room of about 150. And what I felt that illustrated was that there was no difference in the quality. There was no difference in the depth of flavor. Yes, they could tell that they were different in terms of the flavor profile, but they certainly weren't saying, "Oh, that's a blend because that tastes really cheap." You know, there was none of that, and it did make people think, you know, maybe I have been missing out on a different flavor experience because I have, you know, shunned blended Scotch because I thought it was a different quality. And I also remember being at a whiskey fair and, you know, inviting someone to try Dewar's 18-year-old. And they said, "No, I really don't do blended Scotch whiskey." And I said, "Well, try it." And the guy tried it and he said, I didn't know that blended Scotch whisky could taste like that. And that was a great moment for me. If we can get our whiskey drinkers to try blended Scotch whisky, and you know, if you think about our double double range, you know, the cues that we associate with a single malt are all found in the double double range. So we bottle it at 46%. There's no chill filtration, it's natural color. But not only that, we're employing this four-stage aging process, which ensures this incredible integration, first of all the malts coming together, and then all the grain whiskies coming together, and then finally they're blended together, and then they are finished in a different expression of sherry, depending on the age statement. And you know, a huge moment for us was in 2020 when a blind tasting, completely blind tasting of, you know, blended Scotch, single malts, Irish whiskey, American whiskey, Japanese whiskey, they were all assessed, and the judges did not know whether Dewar's Double Double 32-year-old was a blend or whether it was a single malt. Such
Mm.
was its integration, and that's when it won the best whiskey in the world. And so if blended Scotch whisky is made in the right way, with the right care, with the right thought and the right attention to detail, it really can be every bit, because the skill is the same. we are using the same methods. We're using our olfactory system. We're using our laboratories. The same care is taken with single malts or blended Scotch whisky, and so we really want our whiskey drinkers to appreciate what a blended Scotch whisky can give them. But also, thinking about our single malts as well, our Aberfeldy Exceptional Cask series. We recently did an Aberfeldy 15-year-old, which was finished in Bulgari red wine casks. And, Aberfeldy is, you know, it was the only distillery to have been built by the Dewar's family. So it's very important to us from an emotional point of view, but also from the character of the spirit itself, because it's very complex, but also it's very approachable, and it's very amicable, and it gets on with most types of casks. And we hit this rich seam of wine casks. And first of all, we started off with French wine casks, and then we hopped over to Italy, and we just love the nuances that we get from the interaction of the Aberfeldy flavour profile with the flavour profile of these exceptional Bulgari wine casks. And we don't just put the whiskey in the cask and then forget about it and then keep our fingers crossed. We're assessing it on a monthly basis to ensure that the character of the cask doesn't dominate the flavour profile of the whiskey. And we are known now for our light touch in finishing. That we will always be able to tell that this is a Scotch whisky that you're drinking. And so we're very proud of all of our exceptional casks as well.
As premium and ultra premium expressions become brand flagships in the Scotch whisky space, we're seeing blenders increasingly act as public ambassadors, fronting launches, media, and education to personify craftsmanship and really justify the higher prices. You yourself have become a high-profile brand ambassador for Dewar's, frequently appearing in interviews, podcasts like this one, industry events, consumer-facing content explaining Dewar's whiskeys and new releases.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an ambassador for the Dewar's brand and our single malts. I remember though when I accepted the role and I then became the master blender, and my boss said to me, "So you'll need to learn how to sign a bottle." And I remember looking at him and saying, "Why would I ever need to do that?" And he said, "Oh no, people will ask you to sign bottles." And I remember the first time when it happened, I thought, "Oh my goodness, this does happen." And it's about what I was saying before. Our brands mean a lot to people. It reminds them of things that have happened. When our whiskies have been present at different occasions. It really does mean a lot. And I remember going to Taiwan, and we were doing a tasting of Craigellachie, and there was a guy in the audience, a young man who was a doctor, and he had trained to be a doctor in Glasgow in Scotland. And he said that his favourite whiskey was Craigellachie, and he brought the first bottle that he had ever bought, which was now empty, and wanted me to sign that. And then he bought a bottle of Craigellachie 33-year-old that he also wanted me to sign that he hadn't yet consumed. So you're absolutely right. People, whiskey drinkers, whiskey fans, whiskey collectors, they want to meet the people who, make the whiskey, the people that touch the liquid. And they want to hear about, my journey, my approach to to blending. But that is in conjunction with our actual brand ambassadors who also travel the world and have terrific stories to tell. And the kind of combination between, um, the two of us, um, we make for a very compelling story of our whiskies. But yes, I mean, it is a joy visiting our markets and seeing the excitement on people's faces and the joy when you bring something new to their market. Um, I love visiting the US, um, but also, places like Japan, where they really have taken Scotch whisky to their heart. And they also make their own whiskey there as well. And um, it's really interesting seeing how they drink whiskey again, seeing that the foods that they pair with our whiskies. Sushi goes surprisingly well with Royal Brackla, for example. Um, so it's all these opportunities that you get when you go to these markets that then help formulate new ideas when we get back to the blending room and thinking about the flavors and how other things might work with our whiskies. So it really, as they say, travel broadens the mind, and it certainly does when it comes to making new expressions of whiskey.
You've shared in interviews about your passion for nurturing the next generation of whiskey making talent within Bacardi and the whiskey industry in general. You noted that most of your blending team are women, not by design, but because they were the strongest candidates, helping normalize more inclusive talent pipelines in a traditionally male sector. What are some of the ways you're mentoring and carrying through the next generation of whiskey makers?
When I was coming out of university, as I said, the whiskey industry was not visible to me. Um, there was, there was no one that I could look up to and say, I want to do what they're doing. I want to, be them. But now in the whiskey industry, we deliberately reach out to universities, and we have the Bacardi internship and also scholars. So we have a graduate program where we're bringing in graduates. They come in for an interview. It's quite a rigorous process. And then we have scholars. So those young people who are already studying and they get some experience during their summer holidays. And so it's very important, for the future of the whiskey industry, that we are engaging with young talent so that, they can take forward, the legacy of Dewar's and making whiskey. And, there's so many roles that are available in Scotch whisky. Obviously master blender is the top one on my list, but scientists, accountants, lawyers, marketeers, you name it, the whiskey industry needs it. And we also do mentorship as well. So again, it's talking to people from other parts of the business, um, sometimes other companies, other whiskey companies, and just talking to people about, what their aspirations are and just helping to solidify the thoughts in their mind and and make them believe that they can do more and that the things that they are dreaming about, can become reality. If they just talk to the right people and get the right experience. Um, so, as I said, it was one of my aims that as the first female master blender for Dewar's, I definitely wasn't going to be the last. And, I've always been very open about recruiting more women into my team, um, but not at the expense of expertise. The women that are in my team were chosen because they were the best candidates, and that is non-negotiable. Because it's so important to pick the right people, in order that, Dewar's will be around for another 180 years, because this year we're celebrating our 180th year, and I think that's what draws people to the whiskey industry, is a rich and storied history. And that history is all about people passing down their knowledge to the next generation. And, we have a saying at Dewar's I came across in an article. It's attributed to Gustav Mahler, and it is, tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to pass on that fire, that passion, to the next generation to keep our legacy going.
Well, Stephanie, my final question is the luxury item question, which I ask all my guests. So if you were stranded on a deserted island and you could only have one single luxury item, what would that luxury item be? It can't be any form of air or water transportation to get you off that island, or anything that requires mobile service so you can call somebody to get you off that island. It's just you on this lonely island. You're all by yourself, but you have one single luxury item with you. What would that be?
Well, I think probably going to hate me saying this, but the biggest luxury I think that we all crave at the moment is time. So when you were saying about being on a deserted island, all by myself, I thought, oh, that is a luxury in itself. That ability to sit with your own thoughts. And I immediately thought of the pile of books that I want to read, but never really have the time to. And one of those books is by an author called Vikram Seth, and it's called A Suitable Boy. And it's a massive book. And I've only ever managed to get a quarter of the way through it, and then something has happened. And so that would be my that would be my luxury item, is the luxury of time. But I would also want to have one of our Dewar's Collector's series there. So the Dewar's 37-year-old blended malt. I would sip that whilst reading this book, and then hopefully the rescue team will come just as I finish the last drop of whiskey and the last page.
Stephanie Macleod, Director of Blending Scotch Whisky at Bacardi, thank you so much for joining me on The Luxury Item.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this episode of the Luxury Item Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you found this useful and entertaining, I would be really grateful if you can share it with a friend or colleague. I would love it if you subscribe so you never miss an episode. And while you're there, be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other listeners find us. The Luxury Item Podcast is a production of Silvertone Consulting. I'm your host, Scott Kerr. Until next time.